So it really is a pleasure to be with you all today. And I'm going to talk about my book, Poetry and Theology in the Modernist Period. So that book, which, as Emily mentioned, came out a couple of years ago, has a number of different moving parts. I offer readings, close readings of theological texts, of modernist poems. I go into the archives and look at some literary magazines, in particular T.S. Eliot's The Criterion. But really all those moving parts add up to one central and somewhat simple claim, which is that an important strand of Anglophone poetry in the modernist period was deeply informed by then contemporary Christian theology. So I try to show in the book both that poets read Christian theology, in particular in the 1930s and 1940s, and that this reading helped shape their poetry in essential ways. So just to take one example, and I know that there are at least a couple of David Jones fans in this room. David Jones read, loved, and wrote on the sacramental theology of Maurice de Lattaille. He read and wrote on and loved the theological aesthetics of Jacques Maritain, and that theological reading in a real way informed, in particular, his great poem, The Anathemata. I know that there was distributed before a sheet that had some quotes from modernist poets writing about, reflecting on their own reading of theology. I've collected some of them here from W.H. Auden, saying that theological terms used to be like four-letter words, and now they're acceptable to be used in kind of high society, to David Jones talking about his conversion at a certain level being motivated by modernist aesthetics. And so I argue that poets like Eliot and Auden and Jones were interested not just in some notion of religious experience, but in the specific, philosophically rigorous form of religious thinking that was contemporary theology. And indeed, especially Eliot, but all the poets that I'm interested in, claimed that while a lot of ink had been spilled talking about religious feeling, literature and poetry in particular now needed to concern itself, and this is a phrase from Eliot, with religious thinking. And to bring about that change from religious feeling to religious thinking, these poets read theologians and reflected on them in their own work. They, in their own poetry, wrestled with many of the central questions of theology in the 1930s and 1940s. What is divine transcendence? What is sacrament? What is the relationship between reason and revelation? And so in the kind of shortened, condensed version of the book that I'm going to offer today, I thought that I might address three major areas. So first, just a definitional question. What is literary modernism, and how does an important strand of it respond to the theological debates of the period? Second, I want to think about how theologians of the modernist period, in particular dialectical theologians like Karl Barth and Catholic Neo-Thomists, thought about the relationship between reason and revelation and how that relates to the poetry of the period. And then finally, I want to spend just about half of my time thinking about how these theological questions, these theological debates, this theological reading plays out in a particular modernist poem in T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. So first, what is modernism and what does it have to do with theology? Now, again, I know that some people in the room are modernist scholars themselves, and if you're a modernist scholar, even if you've just taken a class on modernism, you know that modernism as a movement is notoriously difficult to pin down and define. There are thematic definitions that scholars have offered, there are chronological definitions that scholars have offered, but I think one of the best definitions offered was actually by my dissertation advisor, Pericles Lewis, who describes modernism as literature that arises from a crisis of representation, roughly from 1890 to 1945. And by crisis of representation, Pericles and modernist scholars mean that modernist literature puts form and literary convention under particular pressure, right? That it tries to remake, reconceive form, convention, and traditional modes of representation. So in prose, we could certainly think of someone like Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, right, whose syntax fractures and is remade in an attempt oftentimes to map consciousness more accurately. We might think of something like a novel like The Waves by Virginia Woolf, in which traditional notions of character are troubled and remade, so character becomes something less singular and something more choral or communal. And then certainly in poetry, Ezra Pound's famous imperative to make it new was one of the guiding motivations for modernist poetry in breaking from traditional modes of versification, in remaking meter, in reconceiving what might be the proper subject for poetry. And critics have often rightly talked about how this crisis of representation, this fracturing of form and stylistic convention, arises from various historical crises, right? And of course, we can think of a number of historical crises that may have brought about, or at least helped lead to, this formal and conventional fracturing. So the rise of nationalism, world wars, Einstein's theory of relativity, Freudian psychoanalysis, and then what I'm most interested in, various crises of religion in the period. And when the story of modernism had been told up until, I don't know, somewhere around 10 to 15 years ago, I'd say, when critics thought about the crisis of representation that is modernism and its relationship to religion, they largely talked about modernism as literature emerging in response to a crisis of unbelief. So modernism is in part the literature that responds to the evacuation of traditional metaphysical and theological understandings of the world. So modernism emerges after God has been declared dead. Right? In a certain sense, this is a long-standing kind of understanding of modernism. Modernism replaces religion with the work of art. Think about Stephen Dedalus at the end of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But what I'm interested in this book is less a crisis of unbelief, right? What happens when the old ways of thinking metaphysically or theologically or religiously, when those old ways no longer obtain, and more what I would describe as a crisis of belief. So in particular, I'm interested in how modernism responds to the theological ferment of the period, how it responds to new and daring ways of thinking about faith, of thinking about sacrament, of thinking about God, not about not writing that declares the death of God, but that tries to think through how might we in a modern world continue to believe in God. And in order to give you a sense for the theological crises and experimentation and innovation that was happening in the modernist period that I argue informed and influenced modernist poetry, it's useful to take a step back and think about what came before this crisis of belief, this theological writing, in particular in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. And largely the two kind of schools of theological innovation that I'm most interested in. So the Dialectical Theology of Karl Barth, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, and then Catholic Neo-Thomism. Both of those are in important ways responding to and against 19th century religious liberalism. So religious liberalism, which is associated certainly in the mind of someone like Karl Barth, most powerfully with Friedrich Schleiermacher, religious liberalism emphasized religious feeling and experience over dogma or doctrine. So I have a quote here from Schleiermacher's On Religion, where he declares that religion's essence is neither thinking nor acting, but intuition and feeling. Matthew Arnold similarly declares that the power of Christianity has been in the immense emotion which it has excited. So in this classical 19th century religious liberal viewpoint, God is not a transcendent other. God is not something also that can be reasoned toward. It can be reasoned about, but it can't be reasoned toward. God resides within the human breast. God resides within human feeling, within human emotion. And it's a very capital R romantic notion, right? This idea that God dwells within the sentiments. Now, this conception of God dwelling within the human heart is precisely what Catholic Neo-Thomism, and in particular, Protestant dialectical theology, reacted against. And this is where reason and revelation begin to enter conversation. So we can see this pushback against 19th century religious liberalism, this notion that the proper subject of religious inquiry is human experience of religion, human religious feeling. We can see that pushback most clearly in the work of Karl Barth. And in particular, in the second epistle to the Romans, there's a famous battle cry against religious liberalism. So Barth in this work, and in all of his writing, in particular from the 1920s and 1930s, Barth emphasizes that God does not reside in the human breast, but, and this is a really crucial phrase for him, was unapproachably distant and unutterably strange. So God is the transcendent other who is the ground of humanity's being, yet is completely unlike humanity. So again and again, Barth criticizes oftentimes Schleiermacher by name, but more generally, religious liberalism's, what he describes as its subjectivism, its focus on intuition and feeling, its focus, in short, on humanity as opposed to God. So in his preface to the second edition of the Epistle to the Romans, he has this really striking and I think significant way of describing his theological style. If I have a system, it is limited to a recognition of what Kierkegaard calls the infinite qualitative distinction between time and eternity, and to my regarding this as possessing negative as well as positive significance. God is in heaven and thou art on earth. And that last phrase, God is in heaven and thou art on earth, is a really crisp formulation, first of all, of Barth's kind of dialectical first principles, and also the grounds on which he differentiates himself from Schleiermacher and religious liberalism more generally. So Barth's theology has been declared dialectical because it emphasizes the absolute gap, and he oftentimes uses that word, gap, abyss, chasm, that separates the creator from creation. And really crucially for Barth, at least in the kind of early mode in Epistle to the Romans, it is a gap that can never be crossed by humanity, but only by God in his infinite, unmerited, and unexpected love. The other that I want to talk about is Catholic Neo-Thomism. So Jacques Maritain and other Neo-Thomists, including Martin Darcy, who is a really important figure actually for the Criterion. He wrote frequently for the Criterion, the magazine that Eliot edited. These Neo-Thomists argued that we intellectually intuit being from all concrete experience, and that this intellectual intuition, Maritain writes, quote, opens to the mind an infinite supra-observable field. So for the Neo-Thomist, the world is intelligible because it's created by God. Our reason grasps this intelligibility, and this grasping begins the movement towards us beginning to understand and know being as being, which is to say metaphysics, which is to say God. Now, this is all really crucially dependent upon a metaphysics of participation, right? So all of creation participates in the creator, and the creator participates in all of creation. And so there's a deep analogy, not an identity, but a deep analogy between creator and creation in the Neo-Thomist model. And again, we can see how different this is from Barth. Barth said that the analogy of being, that which posits a deep analogy between creator and creation, he said that is the sign of the Antichrist. Because that's profoundly conflating that which should never be conflated. God is in heaven, thou art on earth. But in 1953, Maritain publishes a book called Approaches to God, which stresses how intellect in its various forms allows us to approach God. So for Maritain, again, in a really crucial difference with religious liberalism, reason begins the route towards God, right? It doesn't complete the route towards God, but it is reason, not feeling, that begins that journey. So then in rough, very condensed fashion, this is the theological landscape of the interwar period. Religious liberalism, with its focus on feeling and intuition, at least within these theological circles that I'm talking about, has been pushed to the side. In its place, we have dialectical theology, which is sometimes a complicated definitional thing called neo-orthodoxy. I'll just call it dialectical theology today, and Neo-Thomism. And in many ways, as I stress, these are very different movements, right? One is Protestant, one is Catholic. Barth in dialectical theology, again, posits an absolute difference between God and humanity, arguing that revelation is the only means of connection between the two. In Meriton in Neo-Thomist theology posits a participatory relationship between God and humanity, and argues that reason, and in fact sensory perception, allows us to feel and know a continuous connection to the source of all being, being as being, Meriton calls it. So they're very different, yet again, they're similar in that they're reacting against this notion that the true subject of religious discourse should be religious feeling, religious emotion. So how does this play out in modernist poetry? Well, I want to talk about that in four quartets in particular. My general argument is that poets and theologians of the period were engaged in a similar task in that they were proud to be engaged in a similar task. They were both trying to show how materiality had a radical openness to that which simultaneously exceeds and sustains it. But for today, I want to focus on T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. And more specifically, I want to think about how that poem exists at an interesting intersection between these two styles of theological writing and thinking that I've been describing, dialectical theology and Catholic Neo-Thomism. And I should just say one little bit as some background, that Eliot was absolutely conversant in these theological debates and conversations that I've just sketched for you. In fact, as the editor of the Criterion, he was largely responsible for publicizing and making other literary figures, other literary readers familiar with these theological debates as well. So Karl Barth's work was reviewed time and again in the pages of the Criterion. Jacques Maritain, that Neo-Thomist who I've mentioned a few times, wrote for the Criterion. But so my kind of overarching claim about Four Quartets is that as an essayist and as editor, Eliot was associated with Neo-Thomism, right? Eliot famously declares himself an Anglo-Catholic in religion. And so he is publicly aligning himself with a theological movement that emphasizes the link, the connection, the analogy between creator and creation, and that stresses that nature is not destroyed, but perfected by grace. In Eliot's poetry, though, I want to argue he, at a deep level, resembles the dialectical, or his thinking, his verse, and the feel of his verse resembles the dialectical thinking of Karl Barth. In that, Four Quartets stresses oftentimes how unapproachably distant and unutterably strange God feels, in that it's precisely that gap between time and eternity that leads to the pain of temporal and material existence. And I'd say that in a real way, this is what makes Four Quartets such a complicated and rich and I think moving poem, is that Eliot asserts that the world is charged with the grandeur of God, right? That's a phrase from Gerard Manley Hopkins. I'm going to talk about Hopkins in just a few minutes. He asserts that there's a deep analogy between creator and creation, that the timeless and time intersect, but his poetry oftentimes tells a different story in which the division between the transcendent and the earthly painfully vast. So first, just a little bit more on Karl Barth. So to more properly or fully define Barth's position, one good place is to look at a 1937 Faber and Faber book called Revelation. It's a collection of theological essays by a number of figures, including Martin Darcy, who I mentioned before as a Neo-Thomist who wrote for the Criterion. Karl Barth has an essay in there. In fact, the preface to the collection essentially says that Barth made all of us theologians reconsider the importance of revelation, and this book shows the diversity of thinking on revelation that exists in 1937. A side note, Eliot actually wrote the introduction to this book. But so in Barth's contribution to this collection, he focuses, as he normally does, on the top-down nature of revelation. So for Barth, revelation is never about how we come to understand God, or even really how we experience God's grace, but about how God comes to reveal God's self to us in the form of the Incarnation. So again, it's not about human understanding or feeling about revelation. It is about God's unveiling of himself in the form of the Incarnation. And for Barth, in short, God is the source, the subject, and the object of revelation. And indeed, I mean, it's quite striking how little he focuses on the way that the creation bears any resemblance to the Creator. Instead, he marvels at the ways in which God's presence erupts into this world at the precise, limited point of the Incarnation. And he stresses in this essay and in Epistle to the Romans that this meeting of time and eternity takes place in the Incarnation and in the singular event that is the Incarnation. He says that in the Incarnation, quote, two worlds meet and go apart, two planes intersect. And that word intersection is going to be an important one for Eliot as well. So for Barth, revelation, by which he means the Incarnation, is a sudden moment of rupture that reverberates outward. And he has this lovely phrase that I have on the slide here, that it's theology's job to explore the crater made by the percussion point of an exploding shell, right? So he imagines the Incarnation, this dramatic, violent incursion of the eternal into the temporal, as an exploding shell, and the theologian basically has to study the wreckage. Now, we can compare Barth's dialectical imagination of revelation, so again, a singular violent eruption of the eternal into the temporal, with what the theologian David Tracy calls the analogical imagination. So the analogical imagination is, again, associated with Catholicism, with Neo-Thomism, and it emphasizes that analogy of being that I've mentioned a few times. Posits that there is a deep correspondence between the Creator and the creation. And in this vision, this theological vision, the world is seen itself as, in some sense, sacrament, as embodying God's presence, which again is very different from Barth, who says, God is in heaven, thou art on earth. The analogical imagination imagines that the earth, time, materiality itself bears God's presence within it. So as a distillation of this analogical worldview, we might consider Gerard Manley Hopkins's great poem, God's Grandeur. And the poem famously opens, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Now, Hopkins retains the startling nature of revelation, that rupture that Barth talks about, and you can hear it in the percussive sounds of the opening, right? Flame out, shook foil, crushed. But what is most startling about revelation for Hopkins, and I think for the analogical imagination more generally, is how consistent revelation is, right? So again, think about that word that Barth used. He said in the Incarnation, two planes intersect and then go apart once again. Now, for Hopkins, and for the analogical imagination generally, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. So the way I think about it, it's almost like the world is a battery, right? Containing within it God's presence. And every line of Hopkins's verse is charged almost to the breaking point with the compressed sacramental intensity of sensory experience. So I have trees behind me right now. You read a Hopkins poem, and at least I read a Hopkins poem, and I feel like I see the concrete material world around me more attentively afterwards, precisely because he is telling us in God's grandeur, attend to the world because God's grandeur is in the world, which again is a very different conception from Barth's notion of revelation, and I'd argue is a different conception from Eliot's notion of revelation in Four Quartets. So by contrast with Hopkins, we might consider Eliot's verse in the dry Salvages, which is the third of his four quartets. Section 3 opens, I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant, among other things, or one way of putting the same thing, that the future is a faded song, a royal rose or a lavender spray of wistful regret for those who are not yet here to regret, pressed between yellow leaves of a book that has never been opened. And so here too, we have lines stretched to the breaking point. Eliot's lines are quite long here and in many sections of Four Quartets, but not because God's grandeur overwhelms the speaker's language, the poet's line, but because the speaker kind of can't rein himself in. There are long stretches of Four Quartets, and I have another one here, where it almost seems like Eliot is mentally wandering. He can't shut himself up, right? You say, I am repeating something I have said before, I shall say it again. Shall I say it again? Right? His poetry, or at least Four Quartets, is very intentionally filled with these kind of chatty asides. But he punctuates, really importantly, these imagistically imprecise, a little bit chatty, a little bit flabby, heavily unstressed lines with dramatic epiphanic moments. So if you've read Four Quartets before, then you'll know that that sequence is structured around a series of epiphanic moments, right? Moments where time and eternity seem to meet. So the moment in the rose garden in Burnt Norton, the flashing of winter lightning, the midwinter spring. So these are moments of heightened lyricism. They're Hopkins-like moments in a certain way for Eliot. And they are all the more heightened, though, I would argue, because of all of the flat poetry that surrounds them. It's in part because these moments of epiphanic crystallization are surrounded by the kind of lazy verse, as they oftentimes are, that they soar so high. Now, really crucially, in this same section from the Dry Salvages, Eliot says that these epiphanic moments are fundamentally theological. Right? They concern what is for Eliot the central mystery of religion, which are the moments when the eternal and the temporal meet before moving apart once again. And he says these moments, right, when the timeless intersects with time, when the eternal makes itself felt in the material world, he says are, quote, only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses, in that the hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. So to go back to Barth's essay in that book, Revelation, he describes these experiences, the rose garden, the winter lightning, as tokens of revelation, right? So they remind us of revelation, they're like revelation, but for Barth, they are decidedly not revelation, right? For Barth, revelation is the incarnation. And I'd say that even though these moments are hints and guesses of the incarnation for Eliot, they're also really importantly not the incarnation itself, right? They're just half hints and half guesses. They're mere approximations. Now, in his 1934 pageant play, The Rock, Eliot tests out a lot of the theological ideas that will be given greater exploration in Four Quartets. And in the seventh chorus of The Rock, we hear about, again, in a way that resembles Barth, the singular nature of the incarnation. Right? So Eliot's describing the incarnation, and he says, then came at a predetermined moment, a moment in time and of time, a moment not out of time, but in time, in what we call history, transecting, bisecting the world of time, a moment in time, but not like a moment of time, a moment in time, but time was made through that moment. For without the meaning, there is no time, and that moment of time gave the meaning. And again, you can notice transecting, bisecting, that's Barthian language right there. The idea that the incarnation cuts through. It doesn't dwell within, but cuts through. Now, Christ's incarnation then for Eliot cuts through and makes time, right? That's what he says here in The Rock. But just as important for Eliot is what surrounds the incarnation, what comes before and what comes after. And if you look at the stanza before this section that I just read out loud in The Rock, the unredeemed world, the world before the incarnation, is described as, quote, waste and void, and darkness on the face of the deep. And then in the stanza after, the chorus again intones waste and void, in darkness on the face of the deep. So just as Eliot's lyrical moments in Four Quartets are surrounded by poetic banality oftentimes, revelation in the rock is surrounded by waste and void. Christ's revelation bisects and illuminates history, but the continued signs of this revelation are hard to find. And again, it's a striking contrast with Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God, waste and void, and darkness on the face of the deep. Eliot ends Burnt Norton with the memorable lament, ridiculous the waste, sad time stretching before and after. And I'd argue that Four Quartets is Eliot's great poem of the waste, sad time. That is to say, the unrevelatory time that surrounds these moments of epiphany. Barth described revelation again as an exploding shell that left a crater in its wake, and Eliot's Four Quartets moves ceaselessly between shell and crater, revelation and its withdrawal. Eliot wants to see with Hopkins God's presence gather to a greatness, yet what he oftentimes sees and what we're left with in this poem, I'd say, is the Barthian contrast between the intersection of the timeless with time and the vast waste, sad time that surrounds it. And what's more, and what links Eliot's poetic vision even more closely to Barth's theological vision, is the way in which even in these moments of intersection, we're left less with a loving appreciation of time and its processes than with a longing for the timeless. So Eliot may claim that he seeks out the intersection of the timeless with time, yet almost every instance of this dramatic meaning seems to result in an ecstatic removal from time and the senses. So again, in Hopkins, you read his poetry and you feel more deeply attuned to the world around you. You read Eliot's poetry and you kind of lament the world around you. And even these moments of epiphanic intersection of the timeless with time are described oftentimes through negation, right? I have here a bit from Burnt Norton. The thrush is invisible, the music is unheard, the eye-beam is unseen, the alley is empty, the pool is drained. So Eliot says that this is a moment in and out of time, but I'd say that it's a lot more out than it is in. For Eliot, the world may be cut through with eternity, but we're ultimately left with a desire for pure transcendence rather than an appreciation of divine manifestation. But then finally, I would say that's not quite right either. Because one of the challenges of Four Quartets is that it's a dialectical poem, I would say, that wants to be an analogical one. So the dissonance of Eliot's dialectical vision, its discord, its instability, its sense of the gap separating creator from creation, doesn't quite resolve itself into the consonance of the analogical vision, even though Eliot really wants it to. So Four Quartets ends with little Gidding, and it ends with a beautiful image typical of the analogical imagination, a vision of future integration, when, quote, the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, in the fire and the rose are one. So Eliot hopes for that moment when all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well, when the purgatorial fire and the celestial rose will be united. But as Barth would remind us, in this world of waste, sad time, that hoped for resolution is always not yet, and I'd say it's always not yet in Four Quartets as well.